Cuarto 210, señor García, the nurse murmured, without looking up from her paperwork. No espere una respuesta. Hace meses que no responde. Sus signos vitales son estables, pero ya no está aquí. Rosario nodded quietly, adjusting her sweater against the chill of the hospital hallway. The sterile scent of disinfectant lingered, a sharp contrast to the faint drizzle of rain outside. Thunder rumbled softly in the distance as she pushed the door open to the dimly lit room. Inside, the atmosphere felt heavy, as though the air itself had been waiting for her. Señor Garcia lay motionless on the bed, his face turned slightly to one side. He was an older man, in his late 70s, with thick gray hair and deep lines etched along his face. His eyes were open, yet they stared at nothing, neither the ceiling, nor her, nor the rain streaming down the window, only empty space. Rosario paused at the door for a moment, her heart heavy with a mixture of sadness and empathy. She was 24, a woman with soft brown hair, her life far from the stillness of hospital rooms and silent patients. Only 2 years ago, she had been singing in lively cantinas and open-air concerts, her voice filling the air with life. Now, her music had been packed away, her dreams of a stage career replaced by the quiet routine of caring for the elderly. She stepped softly toward the bed, gently resting her hand over Señor Garcia's cold, lifeless one. Sé que probablemente no puedes oírme, she whispered softly, her voice trembling. Pero yo solía cantar. Mi padre decía que la música ayuda a la gente a no sentirse tan sola. She paused for a moment, her eyes scanning his unresponsive face. Without a second thought, Rosario pulled a chair beside the bed, sat down, and leaned forward slightly. Taking a deep breath, she began to sing softly, her voice still unsure but warm with sincerity. Sonríe aunque tu corazón esté doliendo. Sonríe aunque se esté rompiendo. Her voice was soft, fragile, yet filled with a tenderness that seemed to reach out into the stillness of the room. The words flowed quietly, almost as if they were not just a song, but a small act of defiance against the silence that enveloped them both. Rosario continued, her voice gaining steadiness with each note, even as her eyes began to fill with tears. She wasn't singing for applause, nor for recognition. She was simply singing to him, to the man who had been left alone in this room for so long. Outside the room, just beyond the narrow doorway, a man stood frozen. Carlos Garcia, in his mid-30s, leaned against the doorframe, his heart unexpectedly racing. He had returned to the hospital after hours, as he often did, but this time something was different. He had not meant to stay long, only to drop off some paperwork, but the sound of that voice stopped him in his tracks. It was not loud or polished, but it resonated deeply, stirring something he hadn't realized had been dormant inside him for years. Carlos, the son of Señor Garcia, was not a man accustomed to vulnerability. Wealth and power surrounded him, and he had mastered the art of emotional distance. He didn't have time for feelings, especially not when his father had long since become a shadow of the man he once was. But now, as he listened to the tender voice floating through the cracks of the door, something shifted inside him. The girl singing, he didn't know her name, was doing what he had failed to do for years. She was reaching his father, in a way he never could. Rosario continued, unaware of the man in the hallway. Te darás cuenta de que la vida sigue valiendo la pena si tan solo sonríes. Her last note lingered in the room, then faded into silence. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, then exhaled slowly. The quiet that followed felt heavier somehow, as though something was shifting in the still air. She looked down at Señor Garcia, but nothing had changed. His face remained as it was, empty, unresponsive. She gently squeezed his hand, offering him a small, quiet smile before standing up to leave. Carlos stepped back into the shadows, just as the door opened. Rosario walked past him, unaware of his presence, her footsteps soft on the hospital floor. Carlos stood there for a moment, lost in his thoughts, before entering the room. Seated in the same chair where Rosario had just been, he gazed at his father, who still lay motionless. And yet, something about the room felt different. The air was warmer, lighter, almost as if the very essence of the place had shifted in the brief moment of Rosario's song. Carlos leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. No sé quién eres, he murmured, pero lo que hiciste por él es algo que yo dejé de intentar hace mucho tiempo. The rain continued to tap softly against the window, as if keeping time with a song that hadn't truly ended. For the first time in years, Carlos Garcia stayed. Carlos Garcia sat in the dimly lit hospital room for a long time, his eyes fixed on his father's unmoving form. He had come here countless times, but never like this. He had never stayed for longer than necessary. He had never truly stayed at all. He had taken care of the practicalities, paying the bills, signing the paperwork, ensuring his father received the finest care money could buy. But he had never stepped inside, never allowed himself to face the hollow space between them. It had been easier this way, less painful, yet tonight something felt different. Rosario's voice had broken through the walls Carlos had carefully built around his emotions. It wasn't just her singing, it was the way she had sung, with such tenderness, such rawness. It was as if she saw something in his father that Carlos hadn't dared to look at for years. A part of him, a part he thought he had lost, stirred for the first time in a long while. He remained there in the chair for hours, his thoughts wandering, but his eyes never leaving his father's face. His thoughts turned to the past, to the years when the house had been filled with music. His mother humming soft lullabies, his father's violin playing late into the night. Those were memories that had faded with time, along with the warmth that had once filled their home. Carlos leaned back in the chair, running a hand over his face. He thought about how distant he and his father had become since his mother's death. He had been only 12 when she passed away, but it was enough to fracture their family. His father, Henry Garcia, was a violinist of some repute, talented and disciplined, but always absent, always lost in his music. After his mother died, the silence between them had become unbearable. Carlos had grown resentful of the absence that seemed to fill the space where his father's love should have been. The man he had once looked up to was now nothing more than a distant figure, a shadow of the person he had once been. Carlos stood and walked to the window, staring out into the night. The rain had stopped, and the sky was clearing. It felt like a sign, though he couldn't quite explain why. The next evening, Carlos returned to the hospital. He didn't know why, but something called him back. He had thought about Rosario's voice all day, how it had cut through the walls he had built, how it had made him feel something again. He had come to the hospital this time not as the son fulfilling his duty, but as someone who might be seeking redemption, or at least understanding. He stood just outside the door to room 210, his heart racing. The hall was quiet, and the nurses had long since gone home for the night. Carlos peered inside, trying to catch a glimpse of Rosario, but all he saw was the back of her head as she sat by his father's side. She was singing again, her voice so soft that it almost felt like she was speaking directly to him. Solo queda la esperanza en los momentos de dolor. Her voice was sweet and soft, like a lullaby that promised peace. Carlos's heart tightened as he realized the words were for his father, not just a song, but a prayer for someone lost in the quiet. He stayed there for a while, hidden in the shadows, just listening. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel. He had never been the kind of man to let his emotions control him, to let vulnerability be his guide. But here, in the darkened hallway of this hospital, with the sound of Rosario's voice in his ears, he felt something break inside him. He wanted to go in. He wanted to speak to his father, but something held him back. As if by instinct, he stepped forward, his footsteps soft on the tiled floor. Rosario's voice continued, unaffected by his presence, as if she was singing not for an audience, but for the man who lay motionless in the bed. She finished the song with a quiet exhale, then sat back in the chair, her hand still resting on Señor Garcia's. She didn't look up, but Carlos could see the sadness in her eyes. She didn't expect a reaction from his father, but she still came back every night, as if offering him the solace he could no longer provide for himself. Carlos hesitated before stepping inside the room. He cleared his throat softly to announce his presence, though he wasn't sure why he felt the need to. Rosario looked up, startled. Her hand faltered on his father's. She blinked and stood up quickly, her face flushed. "Lo siento, I didn't mean to disturb you," she said, her voice apologetic. Carlos smiled softly. "You didn't disturb me," he replied. "In fact, your voice—" He paused, unsure of how to finish the sentence. "It's beautiful." Rosario seemed taken aback by the compliment. She hesitated before speaking again. "I didn't know if he could hear me," she said quietly. "But it feels like he does, somehow." Carlos nodded slowly. "He does," he said, though his words were more a reassurance for himself than for her. I haven't been here in a long time, but I'm here now."
Rosario gave him a small, understanding smile. She reached over and adjusted the blanket over Garcia's legs. "It's never too late," she said softly. "He's always here. Maybe he's just waiting for someone to notice." Carlos swallowed hard. The weight of her words felt heavier than any he had ever experienced. It wasn't just his father he had been ignoring for all these years, it was his own heart. Carlos returned to the hospital the next evening, just as he had the night before. He couldn't explain why he felt compelled to keep coming back. There was something about Rosario's voice that stirred something deep within him, a longing for connection that he had buried for far too long. He stood once again outside room 210, taking a deep breath before pushing the door open. This time, he wasn't hiding in the shadows. He wanted to be seen. He needed to be seen. The soft murmur of Rosario's voice greeted him as he entered, and he saw her sitting by his father's side, her hand resting gently over Garcia's. She was humming a melody that Carlos didn't recognize, but it felt familiar, like the lullabies his mother used to sing to him when he was a child. "Yo te espera en el silencio," Rosario sang softly, her voice warm and soothing. The words seemed to echo in the quiet room, filling the space with something soft and gentle. Carlos stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what he was expecting, but he was certain that he needed to be here, needed to be present in this moment. He walked over to the chair beside Rosario and sat down, his eyes never leaving his father's motionless form. "I didn't know if you'd be here tonight," Rosario said, her voice still soft but more confident now. She turned to face him with a small smile. "But I'm glad you are," Carlos smiled back, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I've been avoiding this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't avoid it anymore." Rosario nodded as if she understood. "It's hard, isn't it?" she said gently. "Sometimes we think if we keep our distance, it won't hurt as much. But it always hurts." Carlos swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He hadn't realized just how much he had been holding back all these years. "I don't even know who he is anymore," he confessed, his voice cracking. "I used to admire him. He was everything to me. But after my mother died, I don't know what happened. We just drifted apart." Rosario's expression softened with empathy. "It's not easy to understand," she said quietly. "But maybe it's not about understanding. Maybe it's about being here now, with him. Maybe it's about letting go of the past and starting fresh." Carlos looked at her, surprised by the simplicity and clarity in her words. It was as if she understood him better than anyone ever had. "I don't know how to start," he murmured. Rosario smiled softly. "You don't have to do anything," she said. "Just be here. That's enough." The room fell into a comfortable silence, the only sound the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Carlos leaned back in the chair, his gaze flickering between his father and Rosario. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about this place, about Rosario's presence, that made him feel like he could finally breathe again. For the first time in years, Carlos allowed himself to feel the weight of his grief, the burden of the years he had spent avoiding his father, avoiding his own emotions. He realized now that he had been too afraid to face what had happened to them, too afraid to confront the silence that had grown between them. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, Rosaria began to hum once more, her voice rising in gentle song. A veces el amor regresa, aunque pasado el tiempo. Her voice was like a balm to his soul, soothing the raw edges of his heart. Carlos closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of her voice wash over him. He didn't know if it was the song, or if it was simply her presence, but he felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. After a long while, Rosaria stopped singing and turned to face him. You know, she said softly, sometimes we don't realize how much we've been missing until someone else shows us. Carlos looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sadness. I think I'm starting to understand, he said quietly. Rosaria smiled, a small but knowing smile. You are not alone, she said gently. You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just take it one step at a time. Carlos sat there for a long while, silently watching his father. He had no expectations, no grand plans for what was to come. He just knew that, for the first time in years, he was finally here. He was finally facing the silence, facing the grief, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The next evening, Carlos returned once again, and this time, he brought something with him. It was a small violin, one that had once belonged to his mother. It had been tucked away in the attic for years, gathering dust. He hadn't thought about it in ages, but as he stood there in the hallway, waiting to enter the room, he realized he couldn't leave it behind. Rosario was already sitting by his father's side, humming a familiar tune. She looked up when Carlos entered, her eyes widening in surprise at the violin in his hands. I thought maybe, Carlos began, his voice hesitant. I thought maybe I could try. For him, Rosario smiled warmly, her eyes bright with encouragement. I think he'd like that, she said softly. I think he'd like that very much. And so, for the first time in years, Carlos Garcia took the violin in his hands and began to play. Carlos held the violin in his hands, the wood smooth and cool beneath his fingers. It had been years since he had touched it, years since he had allowed himself to remember the music that once filled their home. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers trembling, unsure of what to play. But Rosaria's encouraging smile, the warmth in her eyes, gave him the strength to begin. He placed the bow on the strings and tried to find the familiar tune his mother had once hummed. The first notes were shaky, uneven, but as he continued, the music began to flow more naturally. He stumbled over a few notes, but it didn't matter. The sound was no longer about perfection, it was about connection, about something deeper than the technicalities of the music. It was about reaching his father in a way he hadn't been able to before. Rosaria sat quietly beside him, her eyes closed as she listened. She didn't say anything, but her presence was enough. She understood that this wasn't about a performance. It was about something raw and real. It was about healing. Carlos kept playing, his movements becoming more confident as the music began to take shape. It wasn't a grand symphony or a masterpiece. It was just a simple, heartfelt melody. But to Carlos, it felt like the most important thing he had ever played. He played not for an audience, not for recognition, but for his father, for the man who had been lost to silence for so long. Garcia remained still, his eyes closed, his face unchanged. But Carlos didn't expect anything. He didn't expect a miraculous recovery, a sudden change. He was simply here, in this moment, trying to bridge the gap between them. One note at a time, the music filled the room, weaving through the silence, wrapping itself around the walls, soft and steady. And, though his father didn't respond, Carlos felt something shift inside himself. The years of resentment, of distance, began to melt away, piece by piece, with each passing note. When the last note faded, Carlos lowered the violin slowly, his fingers still resting lightly on the strings. The room fell back into silence, but it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. It wasn't heavy, oppressive, it was quiet, peaceful, as though the music had created a space where healing could begin. Rosaria turned to him, her eyes bright with something like understanding. That was beautiful, she said softly. He heard it. I know he did, Carlos nodded, though he couldn't bring himself to speak. He wasn't sure what had just happened, or what he was supposed to feel, but he knew that this was a step forward, however small. He had played for his father, for the first time in years, and in doing so, He had done something he never thought possible. He had connected with him again. As the days passed, Carlos continued to visit the hospital every evening. Each night, he would bring the violin with him, playing for his father as Rosaria sat quietly by his side. The music was never the same. Sometimes it was a classical piece, sometimes a simple folk tune his mother used to hum. It didn't matter. What mattered was the act itself, the act of showing up, of being present, of offering something from his heart. One evening, as Carlos was playing a quiet, familiar tune, he looked up to find Rosaria watching him with a smile. It was a small smile, but it was filled with something more than encouragement. It was filled with a quiet pride, as if she had witnessed something sacred unfolding before her eyes. After the music ended, Carlos set the violin down and turned to her. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know how much I needed this, how much I needed to do this." Rosaria simply nodded. "Sometimes we forget what we need until we start to give it," she said gently. "You're doing more than just playing music. You're showing up for him, and for yourself." Carlos looked down at the violin, then back at his father. He could see the faintest change in Sir Garcia's expression, a softening in his features, though the old man still hadn't spoken. But for the first time in a long time, Carlos felt a sense of peace. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew that he was finally facing it not with fear, but with a quiet hope that had been absent for so long. The next evening, as he prepared to leave for the hospital, Carlos found himself hesitating at the door. He wasn't sure what was calling to him, but something inside him told him to pause. He turned and walked back to his desk, pulling open a drawer and retrieving a small piece of paper. It was an old photograph of his mother, smiling softly in the sunlight, her arms wrapped around a young Carlos. She had always believed in the power of music, in its ability to heal, to connect, to bring people back to life in ways that words never could. Carlos ran his fingers over the photograph for a moment before tucking it into his pocket. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to bring it with him, but somehow it felt like the right thing to do. When he arrived at the hospital, Rosaria was already waiting for him. She smiled as he walked into the room, and this time, Carlos didn't hesitate. He took the violin in his hands and began to play, his fingers moving more confidently than before. This time, it wasn't just for his father. It was for the mother he had lost, for the memories that had been buried for too long, and for the healing that was just beginning. As the days turned into weeks, Carlos found himself returning to the hospital with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The music had become a ritual, something that tethered him to the past and yet pulled him into the present in a way nothing else had. It wasn't just for his father anymore, it was for himself too. The violin was his bridge, the melody a language he had once forgotten but was now relearning. He began to stay longer with each visit. What had once been a brief, obligatory stop after work became an evening spent by his father's side. Carlos no longer rushed through his time there, trying to avoid the painful silence that used to hang between them. Now, he embraced it. He accepted it, even. He understood that healing didn't happen in a rush. It was a slow process, one that required patience and quiet moments of reflection. One evening, as Carlos was tuning the violin, he glanced at Rosaria, who was sitting nearby. She had become a fixture in his life over the past few weeks. She was no longer just the caregiver. She had become his confidant, the one who understood him without needing to say much at all. They had begun talking more, exchanging stories of their pasts, their lives, and the things that had shaped them. In a way, it felt like they had known each other for much longer than just a few weeks. "Do you ever miss it?" Carlos asked quietly, looking at the violin in his hands. "The music, I mean." Before everything changed, Rosaria didn't answer immediately. She watched him for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "I do," she said finally, her voice soft. "I miss singing in front of people, the energy of the crowd, the way music made everything feel alive. But sometimes I think the music needs to be quieter. I've realized that there's a kind of power in silence too." Carlos nodded, understanding. He had never really understood the power of silence until recently. Silence had always been a source of discomfort for him, a reminder of all the things left unsaid. But now, with Rosaria's gentle presence and his father's stillness, he was beginning to see that silence wasn't always empty. Sometimes it was full of possibility. "You've brought something back into this room," Rosaria continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something you might not even see yet. Your father's still here, Carlos. He's not gone, and neither are you." Carlos swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent so many years convinced that he had lost his father, convinced that their relationship was beyond repair. But now, as he looked at his father lying there in the bed, he realized something. He hadn't lost him. He had just stopped trying to reach him. "Do you think he can hear me?" Carlos asked, his voice tight with emotion. "I think he can," Rosario said simply. "He's just waiting for you to see him again. Waiting for you to see yourself again." Carlos sat in silence for a moment, the violin resting in his lap. His eyes shifted to his father's face, his still features soft and peaceful. He didn't know if his father could hear him or not, but something inside him told him that it didn't matter. He wasn't playing for a response anymore. He was playing for the connection, the kind of connection that transcended words, transcended even music itself. With a deep breath, Carlos raised the violin again and began to play. The music was slower this time, gentler, as though each note was being shaped by the memories he had carried with him for so long. He played a simple tune, one his mother used to sing. He had never realized how much he missed it until this very moment. As the final note lingered in the air, Carlos felt something shift inside him, like a long-held breath being exhaled. It wasn't a sudden revelation, and it wasn't a grand moment. It was small, quiet, but it was real. He had let go of the weight he had been carrying all these years. He had finally allowed himself to be vulnerable again. Rosario stood up quietly, moving toward the door. "I'll give you some time," she said softly, her voice gentle as she slipped out of the room. Carlos remained seated by his father's side, the violin still resting in his hands. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to rush. He didn't need to be anywhere or do anything. He simply needed to be here, in this moment, with his father. The silence in the room no longer felt heavy. It felt like a space where something could grow. The days that followed became a blur of routine and quiet moments. Carlos continued to visit his father every evening, bringing the violin with him each time. The music became a constant in his life, something he could hold onto when everything else felt uncertain. Slowly but surely, he began to feel a shift not just within himself, but within the room. Sir Garcia's condition hadn't changed much, but there was a difference in the air. It was subtle, barely noticeable to anyone else, but Carlos could feel it. There was a warmth that hadn't been there before, a kind of calm that settled over the room as the music flowed through it. Even the nurses, who had grown accustomed to the stillness of Sir Garcia's room, began to comment on the change. They noticed how much more peaceful the room felt, how it seemed to have a different energy. One evening, as Carlos was preparing to play, Rosario sat beside him, her quiet presence offering him the support he had come to rely on. She had become more than just the caregiver. She had become his anchor, the person who reminded him that he didn't have to face everything alone. "You've come a long way," Rosario said, her voice low and gentle as she watched Carlos adjust the violin. "I know it's not easy, but you're doing something important." Carlos looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her words. "I didn't think I could ever do this," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I had lost him. I thought it was too late." "It's never too late," Rosario replied softly, her eyes meeting his with a depth of understanding. "Healing doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, and sometimes just showing up is the most important thing." Carlos nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. He had spent so many years trying to fix things, trying to force a resolution that wasn't ready to come. But now he understood. It wasn't about fixing his father or his past. It was about being present, about creating space for healing to happen on its own time. He raised the violin again, his fingers moving confidently over the strings. The music flowed more naturally now, each note carrying a piece of his heart with it. It wasn't just for his father anymore. It was for himself, for the man he had been and the man he was becoming. And in a way, it was for Rosario too, who had shown him that healing didn't always have to come in grand gestures or dramatic moments. Sometimes it came in the quiet spaces between the notes. As he played, a soft sound interrupted his concentration, a small, faint noise that broke through the stillness of the room. Carlos hesitated, unsure if he had imagined it, but then it came again, a faint rasping sound, almost like a sigh. His heart skipped a beat. He stopped playing, his breath catching in his throat. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice urgent. Rosario turned towards Sir Garcia, her expression unreadable. She leaned in closer, her hand resting gently on his father's arm. For a long moment, she didn't speak, Just listen to the soft rhythm of the heart monitor and the quiet air between them. Then, to Carlos's amazement, she nodded slowly. I think he heard you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Carlos's chest tightened. He felt something stirring deep inside him. Something that he had almost forgotten existed, a glimmer of hope, faint but undeniable. He didn't know what had just happened, but in that moment, it felt like his father was with him again. It wasn't a miraculous recovery, but it was something, a flicker of life, a breath, a sign that the music had reached him in ways that words never could. He slowly resumed playing, his hands trembling slightly, but his heart now full of a hope he had long since abandoned. The notes came easier this time, each one carrying the weight of everything he had been carrying for years. He played as though his father could hear him, though he still didn't know if he could. But he didn't care. It didn't matter if his father responded, not in the way Carlos had always imagined. What mattered was that he was here, playing, for the first time in a long time, not for closure or answers, but simply because he could. The music filled the room again, a soft, familiar melody that seemed to bring with it a sense of peace. And this time, when the final note faded, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, of something that was just beginning to take root. Carlos lowered the violin, his hands still shaking, but not from fear. For the first time, they shook with something else, something he couldn't quite name, but something that felt like a weight lifting from his shoulders. He had come here with a heart full of uncertainty, but now he was leaving with something else, something that had been there all along, hidden beneath the years of anger and regret. When he looked up, he saw Rosaria watching him with a small, knowing smile. You did it, she said softly. Carlos nodded, his throat tight with emotion. I didn't do it alone, he whispered. Rosario's smile widened, her eyes bright with quiet pride. You were not alone, she said gently. And you never were. Carlos stood up slowly, looking down at his father, who still lay motionless, but whose presence in the room felt different now. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it. He had stepped into the silence, and now it didn't feel so overwhelming anymore. It felt like a place where healing could begin, one note at a time. The days passed, each one a continuation of the slow, quiet process of healing. Carlos had come to understand that progress didn't always announce itself with dramatic changes. It was the small things, the flicker of an eyelash, the soft sound of a breath that mattered. And with each visit, each note of the violin, he began to feel as if his father was inching closer to him, even if he couldn't see it clearly. One evening, as Carlos was finishing his shift at work, he felt an unexpected surge of urgency. It wasn't like the usual tired resignation he had grown accustomed to. This time, something inside him urged him to get to the hospital faster. He grabbed his things, tossed them into his bag, and headed straight for Siercassio's room without hesitation. When he entered, he found Rosaria sitting quietly by the window, her back to the door, her silhouette framed by the fading light of the evening. She looked up when she heard him enter, offering a soft, knowing smile. Her expression was calm, but there was something in her eyes, something that hinted at a shift. Is everything okay? Carlos asked, his voice tight with concern. Rosaria stood and nodded, her movements graceful and steady. He's been quieter than usual, she said, walking slowly toward him. But I think it's a good kind of quiet. Carlos looked at his father, who lay still on the bed. It was the same as it had always been, motionless, eyes closed. But now, Carlos didn't feel that same overwhelming sadness. He didn't feel like the room was filled with emptiness. Instead, there was a soft, subtle presence that he couldn't quite explain, something that felt different than before. He approached his father's side and pulled a chair close. He hadn't played for him yet that evening. The thought of playing felt more urgent now, like it was his way of reaching out, not just for his father, but for the healing that still had to take place within him. Carlos reached for the violin, his fingers trembling slightly as he picked it up. He turned to Rosaria, who stood silently by the window, watching him. Her presence felt like a steady anchor. She had become part of the process, part of the healing. Without her, he wasn't sure he would have been able to face everything that had unfolded. I've been thinking a lot, Carlos began, his voice low as he adjusted the violin. About my dad, about us. And I've realized that all this time, I've been waiting for him to come back to me. But maybe I haven't been letting him back in. Maybe I've been so focused on him changing that I forgot I need to change. 2. Rosaria's gaze softened as she listened, her eyes understanding. Healing takes both sides, Carlos, she said gently. It's not just about waiting for someone else to make the first move. Sometimes it's about being willing to take that first step yourself. Carlos nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He had been waiting for some grand gesture, some clear sign that everything would be okay. But now he understood it. Wasn't about waiting for a miracle. It was about being willing to show up again and again, even when it felt hard. It was about letting go of expectations and just being present. He took a deep breath and began to play, the soft notes filling the quiet room. His fingers moved more confidently than they had in weeks, the music flowing naturally. The melody was simple, familiar, just a tune his mother had once hummed, a song that carried memories of a time before the silence had settled between him and his father. For a long time, Carlos played. He didn't watch the clock, didn't rush through the notes. He simply let the music take him where it needed to go, offering his heart to his father in the only way he knew how. As the last note lingered in the air, Carlos lowered the violin, his chest tight with emotion. He had played without expecting anything, no miraculous recovery, no sudden change. But as he sat there, staring at his father's face, something shifted. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was there, a soft sound of breath, a slight movement. Carlos's heart skipped. He leaned forward, his eyes wide with hope. That, he whispered, his voice trembling. For a moment there was nothing. And then, just as he was about to speak again, Sir Garcia's hand moved. It wasn't much, just a small shift, but it was enough. Carlos felt a lump form in his throat, his eyes welling with tears. His father hadn't spoken, hadn't fully awakened, but for the first time, there was a sign, something that told Carlos that he had finally reached him. Rosaria stepped quietly toward him, her expression soft with understanding. She placed a hand on his shoulder, offering her silent support. "He's still here," she said gently. "And you're not alone," Carlos nodded, the words catching in his throat. "I never thought I'd see this day," he whispered. "But I think we're getting there." The two of them stood there for a long while, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable, but full of meaning. The music had done more than just fill the room. It had opened the door to a new kind of connection, one that Carlos hadn't thought was possible. He had come to the hospital seeking a miracle, but now he realized that the miracle wasn't something grand, it was something quiet, something small. It was the movement of his father's hand. It was the gentle hope that something had begun to heal, and it was the soft, steady presence of Rosaria, who had helped him see that healing didn't always have to be dramatic. Sometimes it was just the willingness to show up, over and over, with love and patience. Carlos stayed by his father's side for a little while longer, letting the peace of the moment settle around them. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time in years, Carlos felt like they were on the path to something better. The days that followed were filled with a quiet optimism, the kind that comes not from big, sweeping changes, but from the small, meaningful moments that accumulate over time. Carlos continued to visit his father every evening, bringing the violin with him as he always had. He didn't expect miracles anymore. He didn't expect his father to suddenly sit up and speak, or for the years of silence to be erased in a single night. But he did begin to notice small changes, a slight movement of his father's fingers, the soft rise and fall of his chest, the occasional flicker of awareness in his eyes. Though the progress was slow, it was progress nonetheless. And with each visit, each note of music, Carlos felt something inside himself begin to heal as well. He no longer came to the hospital with the same sense of desperation, as if he were trying to fix something that was beyond repair. Instead, he came with a quiet hope, knowing that even the smallest step forward was still a step. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Carlos arrived at the hospital later than usual. He was tired, his mind filled with the usual worries and responsibilities, but as he stepped into room 210, he felt something shift in the air, a sense of calm, a sense that something important had just happened. Rosaria was sitting by the window, her back to the door, her fingers gently tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She turned when she heard him enter, offering him a smile that was both tired and full of hope. "You moved," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "Just now." His fingers. He's starting to respond. Carlos felt a lump form in his throat. "Really?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Rosaria nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I think he's finally hearing you. Carlos. The music, it's reaching him. And maybe it's reaching him in a way that words never could. Carlos's heart skipped. He couldn't quite believe it, but he could feel it in the air, in the stillness of the room. There was a presence here now, one that had been missing for so long. It wasn't just the steady beeping of the machines or the soft hum of the lights. It was something deeper, something alive. He walked slowly toward his father's side, his hand trembling as he reached out to gently touch his father's hand. It was warm, the skin still soft, though the years had taken their toll. Dad, Carlos whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Can you hear me? For a moment, there was nothing. But then, just as he was about to pull his hand away, he felt it. The faintest squeeze. His father's fingers wrapped around his hand, almost imperceptibly. But it was enough. Carlos's heart surged in his chest. Dad, he said again, his voice trembling. Can you hear me? This time, there was no doubt. His father's eyes fluttered open, just for a moment. His gaze was distant, unfocused, but there was something there, a flicker of recognition. Carlos held his breath, his pulse racing. Rosaria stepped closer, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. He's still here, Carlos. He's still here. Carlos's voice was raw as he spoke again. Dad, it's me, Carlos. I'm here. His father's eyes shifted slightly, as if trying to focus, trying to find something in the haze of his mind. It wasn't much, just the faintest sign, but to Carlos, it was everything. It was proof that the connection was being made, that the silence was starting to break. Tears welled in Carlos's eyes, but he didn't look away. He didn't want to miss a single moment. I'm here, Dad. I've always been here. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the machines, the soft hum of the room, and the quiet rhythm of their breathing. But in that silence, there was a new understanding, a new beginning.